Welcome to the 2015 Constitution and Citizenship Day lecture. You should have your constitutions that we've handed out. If you don't have one, we'll make sure you get one before you leave. This is my favorite holiday. Constitution Day and Constitution and Citizenship Day is an American federal holiday that recognizes the adoption of the U.S. Constitution and those who became U.S. citizens. It's normally observed on September 17th, the day in 1787 that delegates to the Constitutional Convention signed the document in Philadelphia. The present holiday dates back to 2004 when Senator Robert Byrd made sure that this was a celebration and a federal holiday that everyone could get behind, and he made sure that this became law. Constitution and Citizenship Day recognizes both the Constitution and the responsibilities of being a U.S. citizen. But the Department of Political Science has long celebrated Constitution Day. And so we put on this program and invite talented speakers to come and share with us about the Constitution and particular controversies that are going on at that time. And it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor Graber from the University of Maryland School of Law. He holds an appointment as the Jacob France Professor of Constitutionalism. Prior to this appointment in May of 2015, he held a faculty position in the Department of Politics and Government at the University of Maryland College Park from 1993 to 2007. He has taught at the University of Maryland School of Law since the fall of 2002. Since arriving at that school, Professor Graber has served as Associate Dean for Research and Faculty Development from 2010 to 2013. He's helped to organize events which attract scholars from around the country to the law school, and he's taught a variety of courses. He is recognized as one of the leading scholars in the country on constitutional law and politics. He is co-author or co-editor or co-author of 8 books, over 70 academic journal articles or book chapters, scores of book reviews, and over 100 academic and community-based presentations. Most recently, he is the author of A New Introduction to American Constitutionalism from Oxford University Press, and along with 2 co-editors, he's co-editor of a 2-volume set entitled American Constitutionalism, Structures and Powers, and Rights and Powers, and they're also from Oxford University Press. He's a scholar in demand, one of my favorite scholars to read, and he lends his expertise to numerous academic societies and associations, including the American Association of Law Schools. He is presently working on Forged in Failure, a book that will examine how much constitutional change in the United States has been caused by the failure of constitutional practices to function as expected. He's a wonderful scholar, a great academic, and a wonderful colleague. I introduce Professor Graber.
Thank you very much for the generous introduction and the generous invitation. I always like to think of Constitution Day as Mother's Day for constitutional law professors. We get taken out to dinner. People say nice things about us, and for one day, we get to tell the world what we think and they listen to us. What happens on the next day is a fair question, but at least it's one day. I got the idea, today's talk, from a panel I was on in September 2000, sorry, more like October 2001, might have been November. And the dominant theme of the panel, you may have heard before, was after September 11th, everything was different. Heard that over and over again. I thought to myself, well, the Beltway was crowded again today. It was just as crowded as it was before September 11th. My kids still weren't cleaning their room. My beloved New York Giants found ways to lose games that were unimaginable before 9/11 and after 9/11. So at least not everything had changed. And then I begun to listen to the Bush administration spokesman, and the Bush administration spokesman said everything had changed. So we need to restrict habeas corpus rights. And I thought to myself, well, that's interesting, because before 9/11, the Bush administration was trying to restrict habeas corpus rights. And then, someone said, well, what about gun rights? And the Bush administration spokesman looked and said, we're not the sort of administration that restricts civil liberties in wartime. Our position on gun rights remains the same. And so inspired, I'm going to ask myself, is it the case that everything changes in wartime? That during wartime, civil liberties in particular get clobbered? The only issue is how much they get clobbered. And the real issue we talk about is to what extent is the Constitution on during wartime, such that the government is really obligated to obey civil liberties in times of war and in peace. Now, this runs against the grain of what we are taught. So when we are told stories about what happens to civil liberties in wartime, we begin in 1798, the first sort of war the United States fought as a nation. There was an undeclared war with France. And while the undeclared war with France was going on, Congress passed the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were a set of laws restricting free speech and the rights of aliens. We know Lincoln, during the Civil War, dramatically restricted the Copperhead press, the press that basically said the South was right to secede, we should beg, get on our knees to ask them back, this is a fruitless war, we should get rid of Lincoln, and they said so in much less polite terms, and Nixon restricted them. There was a congressman who spoke out a little too broadly against the war. He was removed from Congress and then exiled to Canada. During World War I, critics of the war were imprisoned. They were imprisoned for criticizing the war, and sometimes their criticisms were stunningly mild. So there was a knitting bee in Minnesota where women got around and they knitted socks for soldiers. Somebody said, oh, no soldier ever sees those socks. 6 years, because that was discouraging the knitting bee. We know about the Japanese internment during World War II, in part because John Belushi made a movie about it, but in part, it's in the national consciousness. During World War II, Japanese Americans were removed, and while we're not supposed to call them concentration camps, and I do not call them concentration camps because they weren't executed, they were detention camps. They were not good circumstances. They were crowded to a room, and they were removed there for a year or so. We know about Joseph McCarthy during the Cold War and the lives that were ruined by the House Un-Americans Committee. And we know about all the restrictions the Bush administration put on during the War on Terror. And so it's not surprising, given these stories, that our question has always been, how much should civil liberties be restricted in wartime? But what I want to tell you today is some different kind of stories. The first is what we might think of as a total non-story. Namely, there are a set of civil rights in this country whose history is entirely indifferent to whether the United States is at war, declared, undeclared, or whatever. So if you read histories of capital punishment, there's a very good one by Stuart Banner. And at no point does it mention whether the United States is at war. Because in fact, When we look at the death penalty, it's not the case that war is associated with rises or decreases, or increases and decreases in the number of people being executed. It's not the case that anyone says, well, we're at war, therefore we have to execute more people or execute less people. It's not the case that any major decisions on capital punishment are handed down during wartime where we think it's actually that we're at war that's fueling the decision. The right seems utterly oblivious to wartime. The history of the right to bear arms. Again, you might think if anything ought to have a history that involves war, the right to bear arms. It turns out no. There are crucial junctures in the right to bear arms, and they have no relation with war. And then we also discover there are some wars for whom or for which we have no stories. The War of 1812. Most of what we know about the War of 1812, right, was it took place in 1812. That's about all the American people know of the War of 1812. There actually is a civil liberties story I'm going to tell, but it's not one in the national consciousness. Again, the Mexican War doesn't seem to have generated a lot of civil liberties. So one might say, okay, why is it some rights get restricted in wartime and others don't? Why is it that some wars lead to restrictions? Rights? And moreover, why is it some people's rights get restricted? So we tell the story of the Japanese internment, but notice during World War II, we do not tell stories of German and Italian Americans being interned. And we're actually going to see there's a counter story about that. So I simply want to start with this is a puzzle. And then the puzzle we're going to increase in two ways. First, it's going to turn out that proponents of increased restrictions don't always win. In some wars, people try to restrict rights and they lose badly. They get clobbered. The country reaffirms commitments to civil liberties. And in other instances, we're going to see actual expansions, and they're not expansions that are accidents. That is to say, it simply happened that rights got expanded during war. They're expansions that occurred because of the war. So to give a very simple example of what I might mean because of the war. In the first 50 years of American history, Army chaplains had to be Christians. During the Civil War, a Jewish unit was recruited. And they were assigned a nice Protestant chaplain. And as you can imagine, that was not really good. They petitioned the president, they petitioned Congress, and the result, the rules were changed. Now, every unit could get the chaplain of its choice. Rabbis could be chaplains. But it was this would not have happened were it not for the case that New York was trying to raise troops. It wanted to raise troops from recent Jewish immigrants from Germany, and it realized it could not raise a Jewish unit if the Jewish unit was going to have a minister as its chaplain. So we're going to see repeatedly war has interesting effects on civil liberties, but it's not negative. So to start with what we might think of the dog that doesn't bark in the night. Wars in which free speech was not regulated despite substantial dissent. So we know about the Alien and Sedition Acts. We know undeclared war with France. We know Lincoln in the Civil War. We know World War I. But if we look, there is no substantial restriction on free speech during the War of 1812, the Mexican War, the Spanish-American War, World War II, Vietnam, Nixon tries and fails. War on terror, very little. Particularly people like me. People like me criticize the war on terror all the time. You know, some of us were trying to get thrown in jail. See, violating the law. No luck. And it's important to understand the nature of the criticism, the dissent. So people said things in some wars that led to other people being thrown in prison. So the president of Harvard during the Spanish-American War addressed Harvard students and says, don't you dare volunteer for this unjust war. If you think your place in the class is going to be preserved, not if I can help it. Now, during World War I, people volunteer who discouraged volunteering were arrested. The president of Harvard just went on. Francis Adams, the great-grandson of John Adams, spoke of the very gallant resistance the Filipinos are making against our wholly unprovoked assault against them. Nothing happened. This began to bother anti-imperialists in the United States, because part of what they were trying to do was demonstrate that military adventurism abroad would lead to violations of civil liberties at home. So another major figure of the time, Edward Atkinson, who no one now has heard of, but he was a big shot then, said he had a great idea. He mailed anti-war pamphlets to soldiers, announced he was doing it, and the McKinley administration did nothing. Supreme Court Justice Joseph Story wrote a sedition bill for the War of 1812, gave it to James Madison and said, would you please propose this to Congress? And James Madison said no. Violates the First Amendment. But perhaps the most remarkable story is free speech in World War II. One might say that part of the questions about free speech was that we didn't have a big bureaucratic state. It'd be very difficult to enforce restrictions on free speech in the 19th century. It takes World War I to get that. Well, World War II, we have a bigger state. And in World War I, the Supreme Court sustained every conviction of a dissenter. In World War II, they heard 3 cases of communist speech. And communists go 3 for 3 in the Supreme Court. Communists win all 3 cases where they claim a violation of their free speech, right? But you think, okay, we're not violating, we're not in the war against the communists, we're in the war against the Nazis. American Nazis go 6 for 7 in the Supreme Court. One case, Hartzell versus United States, there's a pamphlet saying World War II is a gross betrayal of American values. It denounces England. It says Hitler is doing to the Jews what they deserve. It describes President Roosevelt in rather, I say, reckless terms. And what the Supreme Court says is, okay, this is polemic, but I don't see any criminal intent. And what is interesting is it cites as good law the dissents in the World War I free speech cases. Another interesting example are Jehovah's Witnesses. In 1940, in a case called Gobetis, the Supreme Court, by an 8-to-1 vote, says local school districts may require Jehovah's Witnesses to salute the flag. There are two consequences of this. The first is a mass assault on Jehovah's Witnesses. In numerous cities, towns, places, people grab Jehovah's Witnesses, they're literally dragged out of their house, they put them a flag and say, please salute the flag, if not, we're going to beat you up. They don't salute the flag, they get beat up. The second consequence is an elite assault on the Supreme Court. Now, part of what you have to understand now, right, the way we say the Pledge of Allegiance is like this. The flag salute in 1940 was this. Does this look familiar? Only, just very little. And the New Republic calls the flag salute the Hitler salute. The Roosevelt administration announces a new interpretation of federal guidelines that say, in fact, federal law says all people have to do is stand with respect, which Jehovah's Witnesses can do. When openings come in the Supreme Court, Roosevelt chooses judges who are on record as opposing the original flag salute decision. The decision is revisited in the Supreme Court, and by a 6-to-3 vote, the Supreme Court, the fastest reversal in American history, reverses Gobetis in a case called Barnett and says, in fact, that you have a right not to salute the flag. And by the way, just to make the war obvious, what the opinion says, mandatory flag salutes are what characterize our fast-failing enemies. And in fact, this is a theme that one will hear repeatedly in pro-civil liberties cases decided in wartime. So one of the things that goes on during World War II and the Cold War is a dramatic increase in the procedural rights of criminal suspects. And how does the court explain this? Well, let's listen to Mr. Justice Black in a case called Ashcroft versus Tennessee, where he says, the procedure in this case, which we are declaring unconstitutional, reminds us of certain foreign nations which convict individuals with testimony obtained by police organizations possessed of an unrestrained power to seize persons suspected of crimes against the state, hold them in secret custody, and wring from them confessions by physical or mental torture. This is what Joseph Stalin does. This is what Adolf Hitler does. We don't do it. So in a number of civil rights opinions, expanding the rights of suspects, what the court says is we are different from our enemies. We have these liberties. Now, we can look at a right and a group in particular. The right is voting. Voting has the exact opposite profile of what the conventional wisdom suggests. Namely, wartime is really good for expanding voting rights. Peacetime is really lousy. So if we look, there are 3 amendments that expand voting rights. First is passed immediately after the Civil War, African Americans. Why did African Americans get right? Lincoln and everybody else is very clear. Civil War doesn't get won without African American soldiers. And indeed, it is rather fascinating to see race relations during the Civil War, because in 1861, the North doesn't like people of color. They don't like the South. In fact, they dislike the South more. But Democrats actually make electoral gains by saying, you know, it's people of color who caused this Civil War. The North likes to win, like most people. And for 2 years, the North doesn't win. And so Lincoln takes a step. Very controversial step. He calls for the enlistment of African American troops. And one of the things every Civil War historian will tell you is whether African American troops by themselves turn the tide, we don't know. But we do know African American troops played a major role in the Union victory. And we also know the ordinary white Union soldier knew this. And it is remarkable if you look at the correspondence of Northern white soldiers in 1863, 1864. There are letters over and over again of this form. Dear Mom and Dad, our rear ends were saved today by the colored troops. You would not believe the courage with which they fought. We have been treating these people badly, and we have to treat them better. For the next 40 years, the most racially egalitarian white group in the country is the Grand Army of the Republic veterans. They were the people who watched African Americans fight. They are for expanding all of their rights. See, one of the virtues that war does, if you're an outgroup, war gives you the opportunity to demonstrate capacities. So African Americans fight in Civil War, and they get the right to vote. Now we move to World War I. World War I is the first war that is fought by industrial states. But the United States has got a problem, like every other country. Namely, the men are at the front. Who's going to operate the factories? Answer, women. You know, they're incompetent. We all know that, guys. But, you know, they're the only people left. And lo and behold, women do a good job at the factories. And Woodrow Wilson and many other national leaders gets up before Congress, and the other national leaders get up before their Congress, and they say, women have earned the right to vote through their service. During the Vietnam era, there was an issue. Should 18-year-olds have the right to vote? The argument was simple. If they're fighting, they have the right to vote. And in pretty much every country, if there's a war going on and you can be drafted, you have a right to vote. A version of this took place around 1942 when Sadie Graeber went before the judge, Citizenship. The judge asked, okay, you have a family, my husband died. I have 2 daughters and 2 sons. Where's your, what are they doing? Well, my oldest son is in the Philippines fighting. My younger son was actually declared 4F. Wait, you said you're not a citizen, but your son is fighting? That was her citizenship test. Once the judge found out that my uncle was in the Philippines in the US Army, that was good enough to get her the right. I've often wanted to say what we really need for, quote, illegal aliens or whatever you want to call them, we need a war. Because if there's a war and we need draftees, suddenly there'll be I will promise you, At some point, someone will propose the following measure. It's already out there, but it doesn't have enough support because we don't need the manpower. But if we need the manpower, anyone in the country illegally who volunteers for the Army 2 years gets citizenship. So we've seen voting and citizenship go up in time of war. The history of African Americans, the same way. When have African Americans done best? Answer, during the Civil War and immediately afterwards, where there were African American troops, and during World War II. World War II had two features. First, we needed African American troops. Second, we were fighting a country that had a racist ideology. So World War II, on the home front, ended polite anti-Semitism in the United States. So when World War II starts, my father cannot go to certain universities, cannot join certain law firms. But right around 1944, and after we discover the concentration camp, does the "No Jew at Home Allowed" sign look really good? Doesn't look really good. When we need African American troops, the bans on African Americans look bad, so in fact it helps African American negotiators. So, very famous negotiation as far as desegregating the federal workforce. A. Philip Randolph said, "I'm going to call a general strike of African Americans." Franklin Roosevelt said, "You can't do this, we're fighting a war." Says, "No, you're fighting a war. You know, we're segregated." Franklin Roosevelt, "What if I desegregate the federal workforce and pay African Americans the same I'm paying white people?" I said, "Oh, now we're fighting the war." During the Korean War, Truman, to get more African American troops, desegregates the American military. And during the Cold War, maybe President Eisenhower said nothing domestically about Brown versus Board of Education, but the Voice of America, the minute Brown comes out, broadcast it to Africa, to Asia. You see, we're treating our people of color fairly in this country. Vote for us in the UN and not the Soviet Union. So, what I first want to impress you throughout this is lots of instances where war has been very good for civil liberties. So, you know, joking aside, there's an old movie called The Mouse That Roared, where this duchy, Grand Fenwick, declares war on the United States. A few of the older people, I can see they're nodding, they remember Peter Sellers. For my generation, Peter Sellers was funny. He, by the way, is the original Pink Panther. Do not watch Steve Martin. Watch Peter Sellers, please, and see the part done right. But he was also the star of that film. And the idea is they're going to invade the United States, because what does the United States do after a war? They always rebuild their enemy. So they figured, yeah, we'll invade, war will be good for us. And so one might say for a great many people, war will be good. But now we have to figure out, when is war good? What are the features? And I'll suggest there are 4 features we might look at to know whether war is good. First, does the war require extensive economic or military mobilization of people who are presently being denied rights? So it turns out, for example, the Mexican War can be fought with existing troops. You don't need to increase the US Army. So there is no need to give carrots to say free African Americans in the North. There's no need to give carrots to women. You've got the Army already. In World War II, we needed to mobilize. And mobilizing the existing resources of all the first-class citizens wasn't enough. If we wanted to mobilize women, if we wanted to mobilize African Americans, we had to increase the carrots. And mobilization is not simply military, it's working in the factories. All the sorts of things nations need to do. Second, the nature of America's enemies mattered. To what extent does the war lead the United States to emphasize our egalitarian and democratic tradition? So we'll start with the War of 1812. It's against England. What has England already done? England has announced it's freeing all slaves. So, if anything, the War of 1812 has to be presented to the South as, you really want to go back to England? You know, we go back to England, they free slaves. Whereas the Civil War, they're the slave people. We're not. World War II, they're the racist SOBs. We're not. The Cold War, to what extent does our enemy require us to say certain things about ourselves? How do we think of the outgroup? Are we worried that the outgroup is going to be disloyal? So we'll start with the Civil War African Americans. Okay, maybe in the North we haven't treated African Americans very well, but we're pretty confident that when most African Americans have the choice, North or South, they're going with us. In other words, one of the reasons why Lincoln gets African American troops is at first everyone thinks they're going to be inept. But at least they're going to be shooting at the other guys. You know, maybe they won't hit all that often, but at least you can trust women. Okay, you think women in the factory, lots of mistakes, but given the choice between nobody in the factory and women, you choose them. In the case of communists in World War II, well, they're our allies. Japanese are associated with our enemy. Muslims in the United States are associated with our enemy. So it's who are you associated with? And last, and I think most important, and the most boring feature, which is true, is what happens after 9/11 depends on what happened before. So, we begin with the Wilson administration in World War I. Woodrow Wilson is the person who segregated the federal workforce. He is the person who screened Birth of a Nation, the glamour of the Klan, and the White House, and told the American people, you've got to go see this movie for the historical truths it presents. Woodrow Wilson is the person who in 1915 proposed legislation to deal with hyphenated Americans whose loyalty was suspect. What happens when World War I goes around? Well, there's no way on earth. Woodrow Wilson is calling up African American troops. And now Woodrow Wilson says we have to be panicked. If we were worried about German Americans before, now we're in a full panic. Shut down the German-speaking newspapers. Any German American makes any anti-war comment, throw them in prison. Now, we fast forward to World War II. Less Franklin Roosevelt than Franklin Roosevelt's Attorney General Nicholas Biddle, and another Attorney General, Frank Murphy. Nicholas Biddle and Frank Murphy are card-carrying members of the NAACP. Biddle is a strong critic of repression during World War I. Indeed, both Murphy and Biddle are part of an effort by Northern liberals to get African Americans who have historically voted for Republicans to move them to the Democratic column. For those of you who are interested, why is it that African Americans vote 90% against the party of Lincoln? This is where it begins to happen. And if you look, they make a number of steps before World War II in an effort to align African American votes with the Democratic Party. And so when World War II comes along, they say, now we can intensify our efforts. So we go back to the Bush administration. And we see, what did they do during wartime? They decreased protections to persons suspected of terrorism, just as they had been doing all the time. They expanded surveillance in an effort to weaken the Fourth Amendment, just as they had been doing before 9/11. Did they crack down on religious fundamentalism? No, of course not. Religious fundamentalists were in their column. Did they crack down the right to bear arms? No. To some extent, what the war was is a phenomenon simply called now more than ever. If you believe something before the war, you're likely to believe it even more strongly ever after. So war, I think, intensifies our beliefs about civil liberties, but it doesn't cause us to restrict them, or it causes us to restrict them only if we wanted to restrict them before. Thank you very much.
Now we'll open it up for questions from the audience. And make sure you get your constitutions. Make sure you get your constitutions. We have a few more in the back.
Particularly those who are in my common law class, we start learning, what Constitution provision are you talking about? And please quote it because you're interpreting the Constitution, so we're interpreting the words. You got a question?
Yeah, I'm not speaking of the constitutional provision other than things that were happening before change that occurred would have been the abolitionist movement or the women's rights movement of the 1910 and before. So there is always a social movement that's going along with it. Maybe not always, but in those two instances I can see. Are there other instances where the social movements were going along with when war then came along and that changed things?
Well, excellent. A very crucial point is how strong is the social movement on the ground. So in fact, one difference between World War I and World War II with respect to African Americans is the NAACP in World War I is not at all a consequential organization. By World War II it is. Now, if you want another example I don't have time to get to, by World War I, labor in the United States had gotten its act together and was organized. And there are a set of threatened strikes over the 8-hour day, and Woodrow Wilson tells Congress, I know you don't like 8-hour day legislation, but we need the unions behind the war effort, get the 8-hour day, and the Supreme Court at the time had just declared unconstitutional legislation on the 8-hour day, but said no, during wartime, if 8-hour day is needed to ensure adequate supplies, the 8-hour day is constitutional. So there are lots of examples where you need the movement on the ground, and when the movement is weak, again, Spanish-American War does nothing for African Americans because there's no civil rights movement there that can weave a story. It is interesting that Jews benefit, Civil War is good for Jews. And this is because by 1860 the German Jews have organized in the north and they're actually people of consequence. Yes.
So you sort of like, when you talk about the different wars, and you mentioned Woodrow Wilson versus, say, like Franklin Roosevelt. So is it, I guess, is part of what you're saying basically that at the end of the day, it kind of falls with the president that there are consequences one way or another. They can expand or restrict civil liberties or civil rights, but at the end of the day, a lot of it depends on who's in office and how
I think so, particularly in the longer version of this. One of the changes we know war makes is, at least initially, war shifts power from Congress to the president. So if it turns out the president is more supportive of a certain liberty or more hostile to a certain liberty than Congress, war is likely to benefit, not because there is any axiom that things go up or things go down, but because war shifts power holders. So again, war shifts power from states to the national government. So if you like the national government more than your state, war is a good thing. If you don't, it's a bad thing. And again, this is sort of, good, bad, relative. I'm talking, war's a lousy thing. Yes.
Well said. I'm curious, are there any other ways to achieve these conditions without war? I mean, what other instances do the four circumstances line up in the right way, barring some sort of national catastrophe?
Well, I mean, this is a very disturbing part of the world, which is, you would think we could expand voting rights. We don't need a war. Then we could all imagine how it would happen. But here's the truth. The first major expansion of voting rights takes place during the Revolutionary War, where militias literally simply tell states, we're going home unless we can vote. Another major expansion takes place right after the Civil War. What happens between the Civil War and World War II? Outside of women, voting rights goes like this. World War II and the Cold War, another dramatic expansion. We're not at war right now. What's happening to voting rights? It's going downhill. Now, we can all say, we'll declare war on poverty. We'll declare war on X, metaphysical wars. But apparently, historically, it takes a real war. And that is very disturbing for a great many progressives.
Any more questions?
I'll add, by the way, one of the more, I always like to talk about the predictions I've hit. And you need to understand that it's like the broken clock. I am right twice a day on my predictions. But when I first gave this talk, I said that watch gay rights improve during the war on terror. Because the Army had always, remember there was something called Don't Ask, Don't Tell? Then the Army started firing gays who were fluent in Arabic. And all of a sudden conservatives said, no, we don't like gays, but actually it turns out we hate ISIS more. And I guess you can allow gays who are fluent in Arabic to stay in the military. Well, once you allow gays who are fluent in Arabic to stay in the military, you've just lost the war. And to some extent, given ISIS's attitude towards homosexuality, same-sex couples can play. Do we really want to be like ISIS? And it's a terrible thing. It takes a war. It should take common sense, but that's just not the way this country works. So I think what will be crucial is we need to find someone like Grant Fenwick, declare war on them, mobilize everybody.
Which then raises the question, have you ever looked at civil liberties in other countries in wartime and peacetime and seen a similar pattern?
I am, by and large, not a comparativist. I spend most of my time in the United States. What I can say was I spent a good deal of time in the voting literature. And the voting literature seems to agree that in pretty much democratic countries, the big moment is a war moment, which gets out groups a set of rights, particularly voting. Again, someone who knows something about Spanish politics could say, actually, it doesn't work like that in Spain, doesn't work like that in Indonesia, but at least the literature on voting rights I read said it actually works how I said it.
If there are no more questions, I'd like to thank Professor Graber for an excellent.
That's all it is.